Throughout the Tower of London's 1,000-year history, there have been many bloody stories of execution, murder and torture inside the notorious prison. There are many that are well known, for example the executions of two of Henry VIII's wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, who lost their heads on Tower Green. The rack was also used to torture people there, for example Guy Fawkes, but there was one incident inside of the tower which saw the Lion Keeper there poisoned by a man who had been enslaved. But what is the story of this? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Edward Francis was an enslaved African who poisoned his owner Thomas Dymock, the keeper of the lions at the Tower of London, in a way of trying to secure his freedom. In January 1692, Thomas Dymock, the keeper of the Tower of London's lions, appeared before the constable of the tower to claim that his slave Edward Francis had poisoned his household to be a master himself. But Edward Francis would confess, and he claimed he used rat poison to hurt Thomas Dymock and his wife Jane, which he brought from a rat catcher in 1691. He had been informed by another man, who lived inside of the City of London, that this would make the person who consumed it sick. For many people who found themselves enslaved, life was incredibly hard, and freedom was all they sought. But Edward, who poisoned the Lion Keeper's food, was determined to get his shackles removed, but Thomas Dymock's wife Jane was already ill when Edward poisoned her, and she later died. She is buried inside the Tower of London's chapel, but then Thomas would later remarry, and Edward continued to poison the food throughout summer and winter 1691. He did this for a number of reasons, and he wanted to resist his enslavement. Thomas would state that Edward admitted to poisoning his food during an angry exchange, and Thomas said, "What hurt have I done to you, that you should be so bloody to kill me? Did you think to get your liberty by killing me?" And Edward answered yes. Thomas Dymock's new girlfriend, Rebecca, would also state that Edward had deserved hanging long before for breaking locks and many thefts, claiming the slave had broken locks to steal. But he would have done this to try and escape his imprisonment, and it was Edward's way of trying to get his freedom. He wasn't the only slave to try and get his freedom at the Tower of London. 4 years earlier, a 16-year-old enslaved boy from Africa escaped from the Lion Tower. 2 days later after escaping, Thomas Dymock again placed an advert in the London Gazette, with a description of the boy offering a reward for him to come back. In the notice he said the boy was wearing 3 coats and grey stockings, and that he had £10 in silver and 1 guinea, and that he also wore a silver collar around his neck, which was engraved with the words, "Thomas Dymock at the Lion Office," showing who his master was if he was found. It was also said that he couldn't speak good English, and that he had holes in both of his ears, showing he had either been punished for his behaviour before, or that he was African-born, and had recently been sold into slavery. Many people who owned runaway slaves throughout history would advertise in the newspapers for the return of them, and in certain places it began an industry, and people would try to hunt escaped slaves. But what is surprising is that the boy who escaped could have been Edward Francis, the man who poisoned the Lion Keeper. He had wrapped up for the winter and taken a significant amount of money to help his escape. With this he could have bartered with people to get him to take his collar off, or used it to bribe his way onto a ship which may have been heading back to Africa. The identity of this boy is not known, but it's convenient that 4 years later, Edward Francis, which was obviously not the man's real African name, was being brought to court accused of attempting to murder the same Lion Keeper. By looking at what Rebecca Dymock stated, then we can draw conclusions that this slave could be Edward Francis, as he stole wealth before and also broke locks to get free. Thomas Dymock himself had a key job at the Tower of London, and had been appointed as the keeper of the lions for the royal menagerie in 1686, and he held this job until he died in 1704. He would later be succeeded by his son-in-law, but the Tower of London held lions from the 13th century, and these magnificent animals such as lions, tigers, monkeys and elephants were seen as a symbol of royal power and wealth. But what is also shocking is that Edward Francis may have been used in some of the shows and felt threatened by his work at the Tower of London. His work could have involved dangerously feeding the lions and the beasts, but Edward would be then brought to trial by his keeper. At the Old Bailey, he was tried and found guilty of not murder or manslaughter, but simply a misdemeanour, which was much less serious. He was imprisoned for a short period, and was fined 10 groats, which was around a day's wage for a skilled craftsman at the time. but he did end up paying the money, and he ended up being freed and he left prison. But what is shocking is that during the 17th century, people were being executed and put to death for much less serious crimes than poisoning and attempted murder. Henry VIII, during his reign a century earlier, even boiled the cook of Bishop John Fisher, who had poisoned the pottage of the bishop's household, which resulted in the deaths of 2 people. But as Edward was enslaved, it's surprising that the courts valued his life more, it's believed, and that the crime of misdemeanour, which was less serious, was levelled against him. But at the time, Edward may have only confessed and admitted to the crime to make Thomas Dymock ill, rather than to kill him, and there was no concrete evidence linking his actions to the death of Jane Dymock, who had been ill for some time before. Some of the records regarding the trial of the slave are missing, but also as he was a slave of the Lion Keeper of the Tower of London, this may have also spared Edward the hangman's noose. He was considered probably to have been very valuable property, belonging to a significant worker at the Tower of London, and Thomas Dymock may have wanted his slave punishing, but pushing back to work as quickly as possible. But we don't know what happened to Edward Francis after this point. He may have been pressed back into work by the Lion Keeper, but he may also have been freed, or sold on to others. What is tragic is that Edward Francis was one of thousands of people of African descent who found themselves enslaved in Britain during this time, but he found himself at the heart of a royal fortress where many people lost their heads in the century before. He was someone who was forced to work with dangerous animals, and to try and secure his freedom, he tried to kill and poison his master and the family that surrounded him. What is interesting is that this story is not the most well documented in the Tower of London's long and rich history. We know about all the brutal devices such as the rack and the scavenger's daughter, but we know little about the stories of individuals who tragically found themselves enslaved inside of the tower. Edward Francis's story today remains one that is untold, and is not the most well known. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.